The man who would later become infamous as Osama bin Laden was born on March 10, 1957. While some have debated his birthplace, it's now widely accepted that he first saw the light of day in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, despite earlier reports pointing to Jeddah in Western Arabia. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, was born in Yemen in 1908. During his childhood, Mohammed's family migrated from Yemen to the Red Sea coast in Western Arabia, an area that, back then, was caught in a tug-of-war between the Ottoman Empire and the House of Saud. By the 1930s, Mohammed had established himself as a prosperous construction contractor, aligning closely with Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, the founding king of Saudi Arabia. His company, the Saudi Bin Laden Group, thrived under royal patronage, blossoming into a powerhouse in the construction industry as Saudi Arabia evolved into a global oil giant, enriching families like the Bin Ladens. Osama's mother, Hamida al-Adas, hailed from Syria, where her family made a living as successful citrus farmers near the coastal city of Latakia. She became Mohammed's 10th wife in 1956, entering the marriage at just 14 years old, while her wealthy husband was 48. Just a year after their marriage, Osama bin Laden was born, the only child of Mohammed and Hamida. Their relationship soon ended, leading to speculation that they were never formally married, and that Hamida may have been a brief companion rather than a wife. Osama's childhood was marked by privilege and wealth. By the time he was born, his father had amassed a fortune that would easily rank in the billions today. After the separation, Hamida remarried Mohammed al-Adas, a business associate of her ex-husband. They went on to have 4 children together, 3 boys and a girl, during the 1960s. Osama was raised in this blended family, growing up with his mother, stepfather, and step-siblings. However, he was far from distant from his biological father. Mohammed bin Laden remained a significant influence in Osama's life, passing on to him a strong sense of religious conservatism. In 1968, Osama enrolled at the Al-Thayr Model School, a secondary school in Jeddah. By 1971, he had his first direct encounter with the Western world when he was sent to Oxford University in the UK to study English. Despite this exposure, he retained many of the traits typical of his peers, showing a keen interest in football. He was a fan of Arsenal and a fascination with military history. Despite the remarkable wealth and influence surrounding him, Osama bin Laden's early life had a veneer of normalcy. Yet the world he inhabited was far from ordinary. By the 1960s, the Saudi Bin Laden Group had grown into one of the most powerful companies in the Arab world, with deep ties to the Saudi royal family. The company secured prestigious contracts, including the restoration of the 2 holiest mosques in Islam, located in Mecca and Medina. In 1964, they even won the contract to refurbish the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, one of Islam's most sacred sites. Mohammed bin Laden's influence with the Saudi royals was unmatched, but tragedy struck in 1967 when he died in a plane crash at the age of 59 due to a landing error. Despite this loss, the Saudi Bin Laden Group flourished under the leadership of Mohammed's older sons. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the company expanded its reach, securing multi-billion-dollar contracts across the Middle East. Osama, however, was not yet a part of the family business. He was still a teenager focused on his education. In 1976, at the age of 19, he enrolled at King Abdul Aziz University in Jeddah, where he studied economics and business administration, likely preparing for a future role within the family business. During his university years, Osama bin Laden's interests began to shift away from business. Friends and acquaintances from that time recall that his true passions lay in religion, poetry, and Arab literature, rather than economics or administration. Financially, he was secure, with a substantial inheritance of over $30 million from his father's estate, so his future seemed set regardless of his career path. By 1974, at just 17, Osama was already married to his first wife, Najwa Kanem, a Syrian woman who was also his first cousin on his mother's side. She would be the first of at least 5 wives, and together they would have over 24 children. These years in the mid to late 1970s were pivotal for Osama, shaping both his personal and ideological development. Though details from this period are often incomplete or conflicting, it's evident that Osama began embracing a pan-Islamist ideology early on. This worldview advocates for the unification of Muslims across all nations to defend and promote their faith, echoing the era of the Arab caliphates that, between the 8th and 11th centuries, dominated the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond from their capital in Baghdad. Pan-Islamism in the 1960s and 1970s was deeply rooted in the desire to diminish, if not eliminate, Western influence in the Middle East, a region that had been under the thumb of British and French powers since the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. As British and French dominance waned, the United States emerged as a major player, further fueling regional tensions. Osama bin Laden grew up in a Middle East shaped by these dynamics, where the newly established State of Israel, heavily supported by the US, was in constant conflict with its Muslim neighbors. Key events like the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973 further solidified these divisions. During this time, Osama was heavily influenced by the writings of Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian Islamic scholar and theorist who had been a prominent member of the Muslim Brotherhood before his execution in 1966. Qutb's works, which were widely studied across the Muslim world, argued that jihad, a struggle against evil, was not only justifiable but necessary to establish a new Islamic caliphate. He'd also advocated for the imposition of Sharia law, derived from a strict interpretation of the Quran, across all Muslim nations. These ideas resonated deeply with Osama and played a significant role in shaping his emerging worldview. Sayyid Qutb's writings were laced with a deep-seated anti-Western sentiment, painting the United States as materialistic, godless, and devoid of spiritual values. For Osama bin Laden, Qutb's ideas were profoundly influential during the 1960s and 1970s, shaping much of his ideological foundation. This influence was further reinforced when Osama attended Abdul Aziz University in Jeddah, where Sayyid Qutb's brother, Mohammed, was a professor and ardent advocate of his late brother's teachings. By 1979, Osama completed his studies at Abdul Aziz University, though it remains unclear whether he actually earned a degree. This period marked a pivotal time for the Islamic world, which was undergoing seismic shifts. The Iranian Revolution of 1978 had just toppled the Western-backed Shah, paving the way for the establishment of an Islamic State, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Meanwhile, Afghanistan, to the northeast, was spiraling into political upheaval. In 1978, the Marxist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, had seized power, aiming to create a secular, socialist state. The PDPA had strong ties with the Soviet Union, which had long eyed Afghanistan as a critical buffer zone dating back to the 19th century when it lay between Russian interests and British-controlled India and Pakistan. There's little evidence to suggest that the Soviet Union orchestrated the PDPA's rise to power in Afghanistan in 1978. However, once the Marxist regime secured control, the Soviets quickly aligned themselves with the new government. When Islamist groups and other factions began rebelling against the PDPA, later that same year, the regime turned to Moscow for assistance. Initially, the Soviet support was limited, but as the situation deteriorated, the Soviet Union escalated its involvement, culminating in a full-scale invasion of Afghanistan in late December 1979. By early 1980, Soviet tanks and soldiers flooded into the country, occupying key cities. Before the Soviet invasion, Osama bin Laden had already traveled to Pakistan, soon after completing his studies at King Abdulaziz University. Pakistan was, and remains, a critical hub for international jihadist movements. Officially, the country has denounced Islamic fundamentalism within its borders, but in practice, it has often overlooked it, largely due to its enduring conflict with India, a rivalry rooted in the partition of British India in 1947. Pakistan would become central to bin Laden's activities for the next 3 decades. Upon arriving in 1979, he quickly fell under the influence of Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian-born jihadist who would go on to mentor many of the most notorious Islamic militants of the late 20th century. Abdul Aziz urged bin Laden to join the tens of thousands of Muslim men flocking to Afghanistan to resist the Soviet invasion. These fighters, known as the mujahidin, were driven by a sense of religious duty, as the term loosely translates to those who engage in jihad or holy war. In the early 1980s, bin Laden began leveraging his considerable inheritance to recruit and train these mujahideen in Pakistan before they ventured into Afghanistan's rugged terrain. However, his contributions were dwarfed by the billions of dollars funneled by the United States and Saudi Arabia to arm and equip anti-Soviet forces. These nations saw the mujahideen as proxies in their larger Cold War struggle against Soviet expansion. While tales of bin Laden receiving direct financial and military support from American agents are often overstated, there's no denying that he had some limited interactions with U.S. special forces in the region during the 1980s. The conflict that bin Laden became embroiled in followed a pattern familiar to Afghanistan's history. By the end of 1980, the Soviets had committed 80,000 troops, wielding far superior weaponry to occupy major cities and sustain the Marxist PDPA regime. However, outside these urban strongholds, the mujahideen, comprising both moderate and hardline factions, held sway. The Hindu Kush Mountains, which dominate much of Afghanistan, especially in the east and north, provided perfect cover for guerrilla warfare. The Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s quickly descended into a brutal, drawn-out conflict defined by the terrain and the tenacity of the mujahideen resistance. The conflict quickly escalated into a brutal and devastating war as the Soviets resorted to relentless bombing campaigns and the widespread destruction of rural villages in an attempt to crush the insurgency. By the mid-1980s, the toll on Afghanistan was staggering. Over 4 million people, out of a population of 14 million, had been displaced, with countless families seeking refuge in Pakistan and Iran. The death toll was equally harrowing, with estimates ranging from 500,000 to upwards of 3 times that number. The Soviet-Afghan War became known as the USSR's Vietnam, a quagmire in which a superpower found itself entangled with an enemy that proved impossible to defeat. During this period, Osama bin Laden emerged as a key player within the Mujahideen movement. Initially, he focused on supplying essential goods to the fighters and facilitating the transport of volunteers from Saudi Arabia to Pakistan, where they received training before heading into the battlefields of Afghanistan. Bin Laden's commitment saw him frequently traveling between Pakistan and the Mujahideen's mountain strongholds in the Hindu Kush. In 1984, alongside his mentor Abdul Aziz, bin Laden co-founded Maktab al-Khidmat, an organization dedicated to raising funds from both the Arab world and the West to sustain the fight against the Soviet forces. This network became instrumental in channeling resources and recruits into the ongoing conflict, solidifying bin Laden's role as a prominent figure in the global jihadist movement. The funds raised by Maktab al-Khidmat were channeled into acquiring weapons and training fighters. By 1986, this network had equipped and trained hundreds of mujahideen, many of whom were stationed at bin Laden's base in eastern Afghanistan, famously known as Al-Masada or the Lion's Den. These fighters took part in the Battle of Jaji in the spring and summer of 1987, a clash that, while not strategically decisive in the broader conflict, significantly bolstered bin Laden's reputation among the Mujahideen and the wider Arab world. This newfound recognition was partly fueled by the coverage of the battle by a rising Saudi journalist named Jamal Khashoggi, who, despite his association with bin Laden, held contrasting political and religious views. The creation of Maktab al-Khidmat in the 1980s was a pivotal moment, laying the foundation for the global jihadist movement that would later become synonymous with bin Laden. As the Soviet-Afghan War neared its conclusion, with the Soviets and their Marxist allies facing inevitable defeat, the future of the organization came under scrutiny. Some members advocated for a more moderate role, focusing on continuing the struggle against Soviet influence. However, bin Laden, along with Abdul Aziz and others, envisioned a grander mission. transforming Maktab al-Khidmat into a larger entity that would pursue the expulsion of non-Arab powers from the Arab and Muslim world. In 1988, Bin Laden and Abdullah Azzam took a decisive step by founding Al-Qaeda, which translates to the base. This new organization would grow to become the largest and most infamous jihadist group in the world. From the start, Al-Qaeda's mission was clear: to wage a holy war, or jihad, against non-Muslims across the traditional Muslim world. This included the Middle East, Central Asia, North Africa's Maghreb, and even more distant Muslim regions like Somalia, Mali, Nigeria, and Indonesia. Central to its ideology was the removal of American influence from the Middle East and the destruction of Israel, which it viewed as a foreign outpost in the Levant. As the group evolved, its leaders believed that inciting a major conflict with the United States would be crucial to radicalizing the Muslim world against non-believers, or kafir. Unable to engage in open warfare in its early years, Al-Qaeda adopted a strategy of terrorism. Additionally, the organization sought to impose a stringent form of Islamic rule across the Muslim world, based on a literal interpretation of Sharia law and the Quran, and viewed moderate Muslims as having deviated from true Islam. By the time Al-Qaeda was formed in 1988, the Soviet-Afghan War was already drawing to a close. When Mikhail Gorbachev took over as Soviet leader in 1985, he made it clear that ending Soviet involvement in Afghanistan was a priority. However, just as the US faced challenges in extricating itself from Vietnam, the Soviets found that withdrawing wasn't a quick or simple process. Initially, Moscow ramped up its troop presence in a last-ditch effort to turn the tide, but this strategy failed to produce the desired results. The Reagan administration's substantial military and financial support to the mujahidin proved pivotal, especially after the insurgents received Stinger missiles that turned the tide against Soviet helicopters. This marked a turning point in the guerrilla war, with the mujahidin gaining unprecedented success. In 1988, peace agreements were reached between the Afghan government, the Soviet Union, the US, and Pakistan. By 1989, the last Soviet troops had left Afghanistan. The Marxist regime, propped up by the Soviets, gradually lost ground to the mujahidin and finally collapsed in 1992. However, the fall of the communist government quickly led to infighting among the various mujahidin factions. A brutal 4-year civil war ensued, culminating in 1996 when the Taliban emerged as the dominant force. Despite this, they never achieved complete control, with the Northern Alliance holding much of the North into the late 1990s and early 2000s. After the Soviet withdrawal, Bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia in 1989, where he was celebrated as a hero for his role in expelling the Soviets from Afghanistan. Once back in the Arabian Peninsula, Bin Laden sought to use the financial clout and business connections of the Saudi Bin Laden Group to boost Al-Qaeda. He also began engaging with prominent figures in the Islamic jihadist movement from Egypt and beyond. However, Bin Laden's relationship with the Saudi government started to fray. His growing push for a confrontational stance against non-Muslims clashed with Saudi Arabia's role as a key ally of the United States in the Middle East. This tension was particularly evident during the South Yemen civil war. Bin Laden wanted Saudi Arabia to directly intervene to remove the Soviet-backed Yemeni Socialist Party, but the Riyadh government refused to support his plans. The rift between Bin Laden and the Saudi government deepened further over another regional conflict. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, who had been heavily supported by the US during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, invaded Kuwait. Kuwait, one of the wealthiest countries per capita, was owed billions by Iraq, money borrowed to finance the war against Iran. The swift invasion of Kuwait, which saw the tiny nation fall within just 2 days, ignited a global outcry. In response, the United States swiftly assembled a broad coalition of military allies, including Britain, France, Germany, and numerous other nations. The coalition also received backing from several Arab and Muslim countries, such as Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. By the fall of 1990, while diplomatic efforts were still in progress, American troops began arriving in the Middle East, primarily converging on Saudi Arabia. The kingdom was to serve as the base for the liberation of Kuwait, and if necessary, a direct assault on Iraq. True to form, negotiations failed, and on January 16, 1991, the U.S. military launched Operation Desert Storm. Bin Laden was incensed by the entire situation. His fury was palpable from the outset of the military build-up, particularly when the Saudi government agreed to a proposal by U.S. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney for American forces to prevent any further Iraqi aggression into Saudi territory. In response to the American troop buildup in Saudi Arabia, Bin Laden took decisive action. He arranged a meeting with King Fahd, urging the ruler to banish American forces from the kingdom and offering to deploy his own Arab Legion, formed during the Afghan War, to defend the Saudi border against any potential Iraqi attack. The king declined his offer, and as American and coalition forces continued to amass, Bin Laden escalated his campaign. He launched a fierce public denunciation of the Saudi government, accusing the royal family of inviting Western infidels into the land that was supposed to protect Islam's holiest sites, Mecca and Medina. He also sought to rally support from the ulama, Saudi Arabia's senior religious scholars, urging them to issue a fatwa condemning the American presence on the Arabian Peninsula. This intense opposition led to an irreparable rift between Bin Laden and the Saudi regime. By 1991, the Saudi government had expelled him from the country. In the meantime, Operation Desert Storm had achieved its objectives. Iraq was swiftly defeated and Kuwait was liberated by spring 1991. The U.S. opted not to pursue regime change, leaving Saddam Hussein in power but imposing severe sanctions on Iraq. After his expulsion, Bin Laden relocated to Sudan in 1992, seeking a new base for his activities. In 1989, Colonel Omar al-Bashir took control of Sudan in a mostly peaceful coup. He swiftly introduced a strict form of Sharia law, transforming Sudan into a sanctuary where Bin Laden could expand his operations. The new regime welcomed Bin Laden personally, thanks to an invitation from Hassan al-Turabi, the powerful speaker of the Sudanese National Assembly and second only to al-Bashir himself. In Sudan, Bin Laden established a heavily fortified compound, guarded by his Al-Qaeda followers with cutting-edge weaponry. New training camps for the mujahidin sprang up near the capital, Khartoum, solidifying Bin Laden's influence in the city. This freedom, however, came with a price. Sudan soon earned the designation of a state sponsor of terrorism, a label that drew increasing scrutiny from American intelligence and the State Department. From 1992 to 1996, the U.S. kept a close watch on Bin Laden's activities, conducting frequent aerial surveillance and gathering intelligence on his compound. By 1996, U.S. sanctions on Sudan, imposed due to the country's support for Bin Laden and other extremists, began to cripple the nation's economy. Additionally, President al-Bashir had managed to sideline Bin Laden's key ally, Hassan al-Turabi, shifting the political landscape in Sudan once again. By 1996, it was clear to Bin Laden that Sudan was no longer a safe haven. Faced with the threat of expulsion, he made his way back to Afghanistan, where the Taliban had recently established control over much of the country. Upon arrival, Bin Laden was warmly welcomed by Mullah Mohammed Omar, the Taliban's leader. In August 1996, he took to Islamic media to declare war on the United States, accusing it of occupying Saudi Arabia through its military presence since 1990 and being a major backer of Israel. His rhetoric highlighted his deepening hostility toward the U.S. and his radicalization following his loss of wealth and the pressures that led to his expulsion from Sudan. With his return to Afghanistan, Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda intensified their confrontational stance against the U.S., focusing on terrorist attacks. This aggressive approach had been part of their strategy from the beginning. Even as early as 1990, the FBI had raided the home of Al-Qaeda associate Al-Sayed Nazir in New Jersey, uncovering documents that detailed plans to target New York City's skyscrapers. In 1993, the world witnessed a devastating attack when a truck bomb exploded outside the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. The mastermind behind this attack was Ramzi Yousef, a known Al-Qaeda affiliate who had trained in their Afghan camps during the late 1980s. The previous year, Bin Laden had orchestrated and funded the bombing of the Golden Mihor Hotel in Aden, Yemen. Additionally, Al-Qaeda is widely suspected of orchestrating the Luxor massacre in November 1997, where 6 Islamist gunmen killed 62 people, mostly Western tourists, near Egypt's Valley of the Kings. By the mid-1990s, Al-Qaeda's attacks on Western targets were intensifying and becoming more audacious. The escalation of violence reached a new peak on August 7, 1998, with simultaneous truck bombings in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya. The targets were unmistakable. The bombs exploded outside the U.S. embassies in both capitals. These were meticulously planned operations. The Nairobi bombing involved 500 cylinders of TNT, while the Dar es Salaam attack used 2 2,000-pound bombs. Ammonium nitrate fertilizer was packed into the bombs to maximize the destruction and focus the blast on the embassies. The simultaneous detonations of the bombs resulted in devastating casualties. 213 people died in Nairobi, while 85 were killed in Dar es Salaam, with thousands more injured. The undeniable link to Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda led to his immediate placement on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. This tragic event thrust Al-Qaeda into the spotlight of Western intelligence agencies, although the full extent of the threat was still not entirely understood. In the wake of these attacks, Bin Laden's anti-American rhetoric intensified. His grievances were wide-ranging, targeting U.S. support for Israel and various regimes he accused of persecuting Muslims. He condemned Russia's actions in Chechnya, the Philippine government's treatment of the Moro people, and India's repression of Muslims in Kashmir. But Bin Laden's primary ire was directed at the U.S. military presence on the Arabian Peninsula, close to the sacred sites of Mecca and Medina. In 1998, Al-Qaeda declared that the United States had been occupying the lands of Islam in the holiest of places for 7 years. Following their high-profile assaults on U.S. embassies, Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda set their sights on an even grander scheme, a major attack on American soil. Their focus zeroed in on the World Trade Center in New York City, a target they had previously attempted to strike with a truck bomb in 1993. This time, the plan was far more ambitious. In late 1998 or early 1999, Bin Laden gave the green light to an initiative first proposed by Al-Qaeda operative Khalid Sheikh Mohammed back in 1996. The following year was dedicated to carefully selecting and training candidates for this monumental task. By the end of 1999, potential attackers were being vetted in Afghanistan. The candidates had to meet specific criteria: proficiency in English and familiarity with Western life. Among those chosen were Muhammad Atta, Marwan al-Sheikhi, and Zayed Jarrah. Hani Hanjour was also recruited due to his commercial pilot's license and aviation expertise. By 2000, 19 individuals were finalized and placed in terrorist cells across the U.S. in states like Arizona, Florida, and California. As early as 2001, the final targets were set: hijack several commercial airliners and use them as missiles in a series of suicide attacks aimed at iconic buildings. The Twin Towers, iconic symbols of American financial might, were the main targets of the plan, with the Pentagon in Virginia also marked for attack. There were even hints of a fourth plane being intended for the U.S. Capitol, the heart of the nation's government in Washington, D.C. The chosen date for this ambitious assault was September 11, 2001. While some speculate that the date was selected due to its resemblance to the emergency number 911, it is more likely that Bin Laden chose September 11th for its historical significance. On this day in 1683, King John I Sobieski of Poland decisively defeated the Ottoman Empire's siege of Vienna, halting Ottoman expansion into Europe. This battle marked a pivotal shift, ending centuries of Muslim expansion and paving the way for Christian powers to push back. By selecting this date, Bin Laden intended to signal a reversal, hoping that the attacks would represent a new wave of triumph for Islam. As dawn broke on September 11, 2001, the 19 hijackers, each operating from their own cells across the U.S., began to execute their meticulously planned operations. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the unfolding tragedy began with a series of meticulously orchestrated hijackings. At 7:59 a.m., 5 hijackers boarded American Airlines Flight 11 at Boston's Logan International Airport. The flight was headed for Los Angeles International Airport. Shortly after, at 8:14 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, also bound for Los Angeles, took off from the same airport with another 5 hijackers aboard. Just 6 minutes after Flight 175, American Airlines Flight 77, carrying 5 more hijackers, departed from Washington Dulles International Airport in Virginia, not far from the nation's capital. The final leg of this horrific plan began 22 minutes later at 8:42 a.m., when United Airlines Flight 93 left Newark International Airport in New Jersey, headed for San Francisco, with 4 hijackers on board. As the plane soared through the skies, the hijackers quickly seized control. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, slicing through the building at a staggering speed of 750 kilometers per hour. The shockwaves of this impact rippled through Manhattan as people grappled with the possibility of an accident. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower of the World Trade Center at 800 kilometers per hour, 17 minutes after the North Tower was hit. The devastation continued when, just over half an hour later, American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon's West Wall in Virginia. United Airlines Flight 93, however, failed to reach its intended target. The passengers, in a desperate struggle to regain control from the hijackers, forced the plane down into a field in Pennsylvania. This valiant resistance prevented even greater catastrophe on that fateful day. The crashes of September 11, 2001 marked just the start of an unprecedented catastrophe. As the planes plowed into the Twin Towers, over 10,000 people were inside beginning their workday. The impacts crippled the elevators and set the upper floors ablaze, turning the skyscrapers into raging infernos. With only stairwells available, evacuations were agonizingly slow as people descended dozens of flights amid the chaos. In the inferno above, the desperate and terrified leaped from the windows to escape the flames. The South Tower, hit second, collapsed at 9:59 a.m., followed by the North Tower 29 minutes later. By the end of the day, it was estimated that 2,606 people perished in the towers and on the ground, alongside 147 passengers and crew members on the 2 planes. The Pentagon, though less severely damaged, still saw the loss of 125 lives on the ground and 59 on American Airlines Flight 77. United Airlines Flight 93, whose passengers fought valiantly to reclaim control from the hijackers, resulted in the deaths of all 40 aboard. The September 11th attacks were not only the deadliest acts of terrorism in history, but also had a profound psychological impact, amplified by the immediate global media coverage and the haunting images of the planes striking the towers. Initially, Bin Laden denied any involvement in the attacks, asserting his non-responsibility in a September 16th broadcast by Al Jazeera. However, as evidence mounted over the months and years, it became clear that he and Al-Qaeda were behind the devastation. By 2004, Al Jazeera aired a new video in which Bin Laden openly admitted directing the 19 hijackers who carried out the attacks. In the aftermath of the September 11 attacks, Bin Laden's role became increasingly undeniable. His initial denials were quickly overshadowed by mounting evidence and chilling video footage from 2006, showing him discussing the hijackers in the days leading up to the attacks. Bin Laden revealed that targeting the Twin Towers was a form of revenge for the destruction of high-rise buildings in Beirut during the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. At the time of the attacks, Bin Laden was believed to be hiding in the rugged White Mountains south of the Hindu Kush in eastern Afghanistan, close to the Pakistani border. In response, President George W. Bush's administration acted swiftly, securing a congressional resolution on September 18, 2001, to use military force against those behind the attacks. Since the Taliban had been harboring bin Laden and Al-Qaeda since 1996 and refused to extradite him, they became a target as well. On October 7, 2001, American and British forces launched airstrikes against key targets in Afghanistan, marking the beginning of a broader campaign. Allies were quickly sought, including the Northern Alliance, which was fighting against the Taliban's control in the north of the country. The invasion of Afghanistan, launched on October 19, 2001, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the fight against terrorism. Following the swift deployment of American troops and their allies, the conflict saw an intense series of military actions. U.S. Special Forces had already been in the country by late September, but the mainland invasion kicked off in earnest with a massive coalition effort. By early November, the tide was turning. American forces had successfully encircled Kabul, the capital city. A crucial airstrike on November 12 took out Mohammed, Al-Qaeda's third-in-command, dealing a significant blow to bin Laden's inner circle. The following day, a combined force of Northern Alliance and U.S. troops moved into Kabul, while the Taliban either retreated into the rugged mountains or headed south to Kandahar. Kandahar became the site of the Taliban's last major stand in late November. The remaining forces in the city eventually surrendered in early December, bringing a dramatic close to the immediate combat phase of the war. At the same time, Afghanistan began to shift toward a new era with the establishment of an interim administration, led by Hamid Karzai, as the country's first president in this new chapter of its history. The early triumph in Afghanistan proved to be short-lived, as the country soon descended into a quagmire of insurgent conflicts that the U.S. struggled to quell. The invasion, while initially successful, did not capture its primary target, Osama bin Laden. As the fall of Kandahar was imminent, a significant operation unfolded in the Tora Bora cave complex in the White Mountains, where bin Laden and key Al-Qaeda members were believed to be hiding. This effort involved a coalition of hundreds, including around 70 U.S. Special Forces, additional Allied operatives, and Northern Alliance fighters. The ensuing battle, known as the Battle of Tora Bora, raged for nearly 2 weeks. Although U.S. intelligence believed bin Laden was present, the insufficient Allied presence allowed him to slip away. Bin Laden is thought to have crossed into Pakistan in the days following the battle. By this time, he had become the world's most wanted man, with a $25 million bounty on his head, a figure that would double to $50 million by 2007. Despite the manhunt, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda continued to pose a significant threat to the U.S. and its allies for years to come. In the years after bin Laden's escape from Afghanistan in late 2001, his whereabouts became a global enigma. As the most wanted man on the planet, his movements were shrouded in secrecy. Despite the vast resources of U.S. intelligence, piecing together his location during the 2000s proved challenging. It was clear, however, that bin Laden, along with other high-ranking Al-Qaeda figures, took refuge in Pakistan. While the Pakistani government officially disavowed his presence, successive administrations in Islamabad had been known to tolerate or even support various Islamic militant groups. Bin Laden's situation, however, presented a unique challenge. The government couldn't officially endorse his stay, yet the approach to capturing him was decidedly hands-off. This led to a complex cat-and-mouse game, where U.S. intelligence had to rely on a mix of covert operations and strained cooperation from Pakistani security forces to track down the elusive terrorist leader. After his dramatic escape from Afghanistan, bin Laden was widely believed to have found refuge in Waziristan, a rugged remote region of northern Pakistan close to the Afghan border. Throughout the latter half of the 2000s, there were occasional rumors suggesting he had slipped across the western border into Iran, but these claims were likely unfounded. The reality was that bin Laden and Al-Qaeda managed to live relatively undisturbed in Pakistan, thanks to the covert support of influential figures within the country's politics and security apparatus. During this time, bin Laden and his network continued their operations, focusing their efforts on Western targets. The intense security measures introduced in the wake of the 9/11 attacks made targeting the U.S. increasingly difficult. However, the Middle East, now brimming with Western military presence, became a more viable theater for their activities. Following the swift initial victory in Afghanistan, President George W. Bush's administration signaled a broader agenda of regime change in the Middle East. The focus shifted towards Iraq, where the U.S. and its allies sought to topple regimes suspected of supporting terrorism. This move marked the beginning of a prolonged and complex chapter in the region's turbulent history. After escaping Afghanistan, bin Laden's whereabouts became a puzzle wrapped in secrecy. The world's most wanted man was a shadowy figure, with his movements closely guarded and subject to intense speculation. For much of the early 2000s, it's believed he found refuge in Waziristan, a rugged area in northern Pakistan near the Afghan border. Although some reports suggested he might have slipped over to Iran, these claims were likely overstated. In reality, bin Laden and his network enjoyed relative safety in Pakistan, where they were shielded by influential factions within the country's politics and security services. During this time, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda continued their terrorist operations across the broader Muslim world. Despite the heightened security in the United States after the 9/11 attacks, making it increasingly difficult to target American soil, Western interests in the Middle East remained vulnerable. Following the defeat of the Taliban in Afghanistan, President George W. Bush's administration turned its focus to Iraq, targeting Saddam Hussein's regime. The invasion of Iraq in March 2003 was a contentious move, while the U.S. and Britain, along with a coalition of smaller allies, argued that Hussein's regime was pursuing weapons of mass destruction and had connections to terrorism. Critics, especially from countries like France, accused the Bush administration of using 9/11 as a pretext for advancing U.S. interests in oil-rich regions and pursuing neo-imperial ambitions. The invasion swiftly toppled Hussein's Ba'athist regime, with President Bush declaring victory within 2 months. However, the situation quickly deteriorated into a complex and bloody counterinsurgency campaign. As in Afghanistan, the initial success gave way to prolonged conflict, with many factions within Iraq fiercely resisting the U.S. presence. In the midst of the Iraqi conflict, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were deeply involved, using their notorious tactics to exacerbate sectarian tensions between the Sunni minority and the Shiite majority, fueling a civil war across the country. Their strategy included high-profile attacks designed to inflame divisions. One such attack was the bombing of the Al-Askari Shrine in Samarra on February 22, 2006. While the bombing itself didn't cause mass casualties, it destroyed a sacred Shiite site, igniting a wave of sectarian violence that claimed at least 1,000 lives in Baghdad and beyond. As the war progressed, a significant troop surge by the U.S. in 2007, along with political reforms, helped to bring some stability to Iraq. Yet, Al-Qaeda's attacks continued unabated. From his sanctuary in Pakistan, bin Laden authorized bombings in Baghdad and a suicide attack on the Shiite Imam Hussein Shrine in Karbala in March 2008, which killed 42 people and injured many others. Back in Pakistan, bin Laden had relocated to a newly built compound in Abbottabad, a city in northern Pakistan. Construction of this secure haven had begun shortly after he arrived in Pakistan in early 2002 and was completed by 2005. The compound sprawled across a 38,000 square foot estate, surrounded by a towering concrete wall topped with barbed wire. The structure had few windows and was designed to be highly secure, with screens shielding the interior from view, including a high screen on the third-floor balcony to ensure privacy for bin Laden, who stood at 6 feet 4 inches tall. It's hard to imagine how such a conspicuous and fortified property went unnoticed by local authorities. The compound was clearly built with the highest security in mind, and bin Laden likely resided there from 2006 onward with his family and followers, in a location not far from Pakistan's capital, Islamabad. While Bin Laden's compound in Pakistan provided a haven for years, it was ultimately his reliance on this fortress that led to his downfall. In 2009, U.S. intelligence discovered that Abu Ahmad al-Kuwaiti, a close associate of Bin Laden and a key player from the Tora Bora battle in 2001, had become his trusted courier and messenger during his time in hiding. The CIA tracked al-Kuwaiti to Abbottabad, where their investigations zeroed in on a peculiar compound in the city. With tens of millions of dollars allocated by the U.S. Congress, a specialized CIA team was established on the ground in Abbottabad in 2010 to monitor the compound closely. Despite deploying advanced surveillance technologies and drones, the team struggled to obtain concrete proof, such as photographs, confirming Bin Laden's presence. By early 2011, however, the evidence had accumulated sufficiently to convince U.S. officials that the compound was indeed harboring the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks. On May 1, 2011, President Barack Obama authorized Operation Neptune Spear. While it was lunchtime in Washington, D.C., just half an hour later, two Black Hawk helicopters carrying 24 Navy SEALs took off from an American airbase in Afghanistan, heading towards Pakistan under the cover of night. Just over an hour and a half later, at 12:30 a.m. on May 2nd in Pakistan, the helicopters touched down on the Abbottabad compound. One helicopter crashed on landing, but fortunately, all Navy SEALs were unharmed. The operation kicked off immediately with a brief skirmish against some of Bin Laden's guards. The SEALs swiftly moved into the heart of the compound. Back in Washington, D.C., President Obama and top officials observed the raid live from the Situation Room. On the second floor, the SEALs encountered and eliminated one of Bin Laden's sons and Abu Ahmad al-Kuwaiti, the courier whose presence had first hinted at Bin Laden's location in Abbottabad. Moving upstairs, the SEALs finally confronted Bin Laden on the third floor. Their mission was to kill, not capture. Although there are conflicting accounts about who fired the fatal shots, it is widely believed that Matt Bissonnette was the one who shot Bin Laden at 12:39 a.m. local time. Bin Laden was struck in the body and head as he stood in the doorway of his bedroom. He staggered back into the room and collapsed. In his possession were 500 euros and 2 mobile phones sewn into his clothing, likely intended for a quick escape had the raid not gone as planned. Bin Laden's end was as anticlimactic as it was calculated. A decision had been made to ensure that his body would vanish without a trace, avoiding the risk of his grave becoming a shrine for extremists. Immediately after his death, and once the compound was secured, Navy SEALs zipped Bin Laden's body into a body bag and carried it to the still functional helicopter. After a thorough search of the compound for intelligence that might prevent future attacks or shed light on Bin Laden's activities, the team evacuated, leaving the compound with the body aboard the working helicopter. A backup helicopter was dispatched to retrieve the remaining SEALs. By 8 p.m. in Washington, confirmation had come through that the body was indeed Bin Laden's. President Obama addressed the nation a few hours later to announce the mission's success. Meanwhile, Bin Laden's body was being transported to an undisclosed location at sea. There, it was buried under iron chains and rocks to ensure it sank to the ocean floor, adhering to Islamic burial customs. This swift disposal, within 24 hours of his death, was meant to avoid any potential martyrdom. Despite this significant blow, the death of Osama bin Laden did little to diminish the ongoing threats posed by extremist groups to the Western world and many in the Muslim community. As the world witnessed the fall of Osama bin Laden, the shadowy presence of Al-Qaeda was already being overshadowed by even more radical factions. By 2004, a Jordanian extremist named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had allied himself with Al-Qaeda in Iraq amidst the turbulent early stages of the U.S. occupation. 2 years later, al-Zarqawi and his closest followers forged a new entity, the Islamic State of Iraq. The compound sprawled across a 38,000 square foot estate, surrounded by a towering concrete wall topped with barbed wire. The structure had few windows and was designed to be highly secure, with screens shielding the interior from view, including a high screen on the third-floor balcony to ensure privacy for bin Laden, who stood at 6 feet 4 inches tall. It's hard to imagine how such a conspicuous and fortified property went unnoticed by local authorities. The compound was clearly built with the highest security in mind, and bin Laden likely resided there from 2006 onward with his family and followers, in a location not far from Pakistan's capital, Islamabad. While bin Laden's compound in Pakistan provided a haven for years, it was ultimately his reliance on this fortress that led to his downfall. In 2009, U.S. intelligence discovered that Abu Ahmad al-Kuwaiti, a close associate of bin Laden and a key player from the Tora Bora battle in 2001, had become his trusted courier and messenger during his time in hiding. The CIA tracked al-Kuwaiti to Abbottabad, where their investigations zeroed in on a peculiar compound in the city. With tens of millions of dollars allocated by the U.S. Congress, a specialized CIA team was established on the ground in Abbottabad in 2010 to monitor the compound closely. Despite deploying advanced surveillance technologies and drones, the team struggled to obtain concrete proof, such as photographs, confirming bin Laden's presence. By early 2011, however, the evidence had accumulated sufficiently to convince U.S. officials that the compound was indeed harboring the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks. On May 1, 2011, President Barack Obama authorized Operation Neptune Spear. While it was lunchtime in Washington, D.C., just half an hour later, 2 Black Hawk helicopters carrying 24 Navy SEALs took off from an American airbase in Afghanistan, heading towards Pakistan under the cover of night. Just over an hour and a half later, at 12:30 a.m. on May 2nd in Pakistan, the helicopters touched down on the Abbottabad compound. One helicopter crashed on landing, but fortunately, all Navy SEALs were unharmed. The operation kicked off immediately with a brief skirmish against some of bin Laden's guards. The SEALs swiftly moved into the heart of the compound. Back in Washington, D.C., President Obama and top officials observed the raid live from the Situation Room. On the second floor, the SEALs encountered and eliminated one of bin Laden's sons and Abu Ahmad al-Kuwaiti, the courier whose presence had first hinted at bin Laden's location in Abbottabad. Moving upstairs, the SEALs finally confronted bin Laden on the 3rd floor. Their mission was to kill, not capture. Although there are conflicting accounts about who fired the fatal shots, it is widely believed that Matt Bissonnette was the one who shot bin Laden at 12:39 a.m. local time. Bin Laden was struck in the body and head as he stood in the doorway of his bedroom. He staggered back into the room and collapsed. In his possession were €500 and 2 mobile phones sewn into his clothing, likely intended for a quick escape had the raid not gone as planned. Bin Laden's end was as anticlimactic as it was calculated. A decision had been made to ensure that his body would vanish without a trace, avoiding the risk of his grave becoming a shrine for extremists. Immediately after his death, and once the compound was secured, Navy SEALs zipped bin Laden's body into a body bag and carried it to the still functional helicopter. After a thorough search of the compound for intelligence that might prevent future attacks or shed light on bin Laden's activities, the team evacuated, leaving the compound with the body aboard the working helicopter. A backup helicopter was dispatched to retrieve the remaining SEALs. By 8 p.m. in Washington, confirmation had come through that the body was indeed bin Laden's. President Obama addressed the nation a few hours later to announce the mission's success. Meanwhile, bin Laden's body was being transported to an undisclosed location at sea. There it was buried under iron chains and rocks to ensure it sank to the ocean floor, adhering to Islamic burial customs. This swift disposal, within 24 hours of his death, was meant to avoid any potential martyrdom. Despite this significant blow, the death of Osama bin Laden did little to diminish the ongoing threats posed by extremist groups to the Western world and many in the Muslim community. As the world witnessed the fall of Osama bin Laden, the shadowy presence of Al-Qaeda was already being overshadowed by even more radical factions. By 2004, a Jordanian extremist named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had allied himself with Al-Qaeda in Iraq amidst the turbulent early stages of the U.S. occupation. 2 years later, al-Zarqawi and his closest followers forged a new entity, the Islamic State of Iraq. This group quickly gained strength, but their methods grew increasingly brutal, imposing severe interpretations of Sharia law, even on fellow Muslims. When U.S. forces pulled out of Iraq in the early 2010s, tensions escalated between Al-Qaeda and this newer, more radical faction. The divide widened under Al-Qaeda's new leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, leading to a complete split between the two organizations. Remarkably, by the 2010s, Al-Qaeda, once known for its extreme tactics, was viewed as too moderate by many radical jihadists. The Islamic State of Iraq, now known as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, attracted a growing number of followers eager for a more extreme vision. The chaos of the Arab Spring in 2011 and the subsequent civil war in Syria, coupled with the instability in Iraq following the U.S. withdrawal, created a fertile ground for ISIL. Under its new leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the group expanded its control over vast territories in northern Iraq and eastern Syria. By 2014 and 2015, ISIL had declared the establishment of an Islamic caliphate, capturing global attention with their audacious claims and ruthless methods. ISIL took Islamic Jihad to an unprecedented level of brutality, a severity that even Al-Qaeda disassociated itself from. As a result, from 2014 to 2017, control over eastern Syria and northern Iraq gradually slipped from ISIL's grasp as U.S. troops re-entered the region to combat the rising threat. By the early 2020s, Islamic fundamentalism seemed to be on the wane. This decline was partly due to improving living standards in the Middle East, a shift away from U.S. nation-building efforts in the region, and an easing of tensions between Israel and several Muslim nations. However, the focus of Islamic extremism shifted away from the Middle East and towards the Sahel, the arid region along the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. Here, extremist groups have destabilized countries like Mali, Niger, Chad, and Burkina Faso. In Afghanistan, the Taliban's resurgence post-2021 U.S. withdrawal marked a return to power, echoing earlier conflicts. Osama bin Laden, once the central figure in modern Islamic fundamentalism, began his radicalization journey in the 1970s, influenced by Islamist thinkers like Said Qutb. With substantial financial backing from the Bin Laden family's vast business empire in Saudi Arabia and deep-rooted connections within Saudi society, Bin Laden was well-positioned to support the mujahidin during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. He played a significant role in training and equipping fighters throughout the 1980s. Though his initial opposition to non-Muslim forces might have been a historical footnote, Bin Laden's commitment to a broader agenda of Islamic fundamentalism became apparent after the Soviet withdrawal. His growing anti-American sentiment and readiness to challenge Muslim regimes he deemed un-Islamic marked a shift in his approach. By the 1990s, Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were embracing increasingly radical tactics. The group's brutal campaigns reached a new peak with the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings, which killed hundreds and injured thousands, solidifying their reputation for extreme violence. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda are most notoriously remembered for the devastating 9/11 attacks. On that tragic September morning in 2001, 19 hijackers, following bin Laden's orders, orchestrated a series of attacks that claimed the lives of over 2,700 people within a few hours. Thousands more suffered long-term consequences from injuries sustained during the attacks. The psychological scars were just as profound. September 11th became a day etched in memory for millions, as images of the planes crashing into the Twin Towers flashed across screens worldwide. This day marked a profound shift in global consciousness and security measures, with Western nations tightening their defenses and initiating wars in the Middle East. The aftermath of these events saw the rise of ISIL and triggered a severe migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, with millions fleeing the violence in Syria and Iraq. Bin Laden's death in a remote compound in Abbottabad, after years of evasion, did little to undo the seismic changes wrought by his extremist actions. What's your take on Bin Laden's fate? Would capturing him alive and bringing him to trial have been a better outcome? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and thank you for watching.